The Baltic nations have articulated a definitive and striking doctrine regarding railway interconnectivity with the Russian Federation and Belarus. The governments of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania have signaled unwavering resolve on this strategic initiative. According to intelligence circulating within local media channels in Belarus and Ukraine, a comprehensive plan is being operationalized to physically dismantle the railway infrastructure that has historically tethered the region to Moscow and Minsk. Yes, the reports are accurate. The rail bridge connecting Russia and Belarus to the European theatre is slated for elimination. The most critical high-level deliberations regarding this initiative recently convened within the fortified walls of Riga Castle in Latvia. To the external observer, the gathering resembled a standard diplomatic summit, heads of state in tailored suits, rehearsed photo ops for the press corps, and discussions around round tables. However, behind those closed doors, the agenda was not focused on de-escalation protocols or trade harmonization. Instead, the discourse centered on a lethal logistical strike against Moscow's footprint in Europe. The topic at hand was the systematic excision of the physical connective tissue linking the regimes of Vladimir Putin and Alexander Lukashenko to the European continent. This maneuver is not merely interpreted as an embargo or enhanced border control. It is viewed as the physical deconstruction of Vladimir Putin's revanchist dream of a Ruski Mir. The dismantling of the wide-gauge rail network, a Soviet-era legacy specifically designed to integrate the Baltic ports into Moscow's orbit, represents more than a commercial hemorrhage for the Kremlin. It constitutes a potential military catastrophe. For Belarusian autocrat Alexander Lukashenko, this initiative is perceived as the final nail in the coffin of his nation's economic viability. Once the permanent way is severed, Russian and Belarusian armoured columns will lose their primary vector of rapid deployment to the border. Furthermore, the logistical arteries transporting hydrocarbons to export terminals will be severed if Tallinn, Riga, and Vilnius proceed with the excision of Russian-gauge railways. The strategic exclave of Kaliningrad faces the prospect of total isolation, while Belarus risks being relegated to a marginal actor in the European logistics architecture. Today, we conduct a deep-dive analysis into how the dismantling of the Russian and Belarusian rail corridors in the Baltics could unfold, and the profound geopolitical ramifications of this move for Eastern Europe. The operational planning commenced in Riga. On December 4th, the Baltic heads of state convened at Riga Castle to align on regional security architecture, energy independence strategies, internal European Union challenges, and sustained military assistance for Ukraine. Crucially, the Baltic leadership tabled the possibility of a unified directive to physically dismantle rail infrastructure along the Russian and Belarusian frontiers. Estonian President Alar Karis, addressing the potential for dismantling, asserted a doctrine of collective action. If we execute this, we execute it in unison. Karis's emphasis on a synchronized approach signals that this logistical decoupling will proceed as a coordinated theatre-level operation, not as isolated national measures. President Karis further indicated that the operational specifics have been delegated to ministerial portfolios for granular assessment. Lithuanian President Gitanas Nausėda underscored the imperative of interoperability between the Baltic states and Poland in constructing an eastern defence line. He also advocated for the initiative to be escalated to the European Commission for a comprehensive impact evaluation. Latvian President Edgars Rinkevičs clarified that the scope of the initiative extends beyond mere railway tracks. It encompasses a broader spectrum of anti-mobility measures. He alluded to a multi-domain strategy, stating, "It is not just this, there are several other vectors." According to reports from the Ukrainian outlet RBC Ukraine, the Latvian government is scheduled to complete its feasibility assessment on dismantling eastern border lines by late 2025, with a final executive decision anticipated in early 2026. However, open-source intelligence suggests that the operational environment is already shifting. Sabotage operations targeting rail infrastructure in Russia's Rostov and Leningrad oblasts, attributed to the Atesh partisan movement affiliated with Ukrainian military intelligence, have exposed the inherent fragility of these supply lines. the Baltic states are preparing to deliver a secondary strategic shock to the Kremlin and Minsk, not through kinetic sabotage, but via administrative decrees and heavy engineering equipment. The Baltics intend to sever these ties using excavators and legislation rather than explosives. Yet, the shockwaves generated by this policy are reverberating far beyond Riga, rattling the gloomy corridors of power in Minsk and Moscow. The dismantling of the Baltic rail network is not a trivial modification of transport logistics. It represents a paradigm shift. It could herald the initial phase of a calculated, systematic asphyxiation of the Russian and Belarusian economies. Let us first examine the Belarusian vector. The Lukashenko regime is geographically landlocked. The economic survival of Minsk is heavily predicated on the export of potash fertilizer and refined petroleum products. The only economically viable modality for transporting these massive bulk commodities is rail freight. For decades, Belarusian exports have accessed global markets via Lithuania's port of Klaipėda or Latvia's terminals in Riga and Ventspils. These maritime gateways were Minsk's economic lifeline. Now, Baltic leaders are preparing to sever that artery. What is the fallout when the rails are removed? A state of total logistical gridlock is the probable outcome. Millions of tons of Belarusian potash could stagnate at the border. Attempting to pivot this volume to road transport via trucking fleets would be tantamount to economic suicide. The cost per ton for road haulage would skyrocket, rendering Belarusian exports globally uncompetitive. Moreover, the alternative routes are virtually non-existent. The Kremlin has proposed redirecting Belarusian cargo through ports in St. Petersburg. However, Russian terminals are already saturated with domestic exports. Their throughput capacity is insufficient, and the transit distances are significantly longer. This alternative is viewed as a logistical bottleneck capable of erasing the profit margins of Belarusian industry. Yet, the cargo must move. When stockpiles reach capacity and logistics freeze, industrial production halts. Belarus's sprawling state-owned enterprises may soon face liquidity crises, unable to meet payroll obligations. This scenario, mass labor unrest driven by economic stagnation, is the nightmare Lukashenko fears most. Now, let us pivot to the true strategic nightmare: Russia's forward operating base in the heart of NATO territory, Kaliningrad. This is an exclave, physically detached from the Russian mainland. The logistical sustainment of this militarized zone is critically dependent on rail transit through Lithuanian territory. If Vilnius dismantles the tracks on the Belarusian border as part of its eastern defense posture, Kaliningrad effectively becomes an island under siege. Russia would be forced to rely exclusively on maritime and aerial bridges to supply the oblast. The cost differential is staggering. Every ton of cargo shifted from rail to sea or air incurs a multiplier in expense. Consequently, Moscow may be forced to burn through billions of rubles in subsidies to keep the Kaliningrad economy afloat. Beyond economics, the removal of rails introduces a severe military vulnerability for this strategic outpost. If the rail link is severed, the resupply of Kaliningrad's military bases, missile batteries, and personnel will depend entirely on maritime convoys traversing the Baltic Sea, which has effectively become a NATO lake following the accession of Sweden and Finland. These convoys would present high-contrast targets for NATO naval assets and coastal defense batteries in any hypothetical conflict scenario. Furthermore, the physical severance of the rails could induce a psychological siege mentality within Kaliningrad. The population may feel irrevocably cut off from the motherland. The visible absence of physical connectivity is a demoralizing signal for the exclave, potentially triggering a wave of panic that could undermine Moscow's authority in the region. The Latvian president's acknowledgement of the socio-economic impact indicates a clear-eyed recognition that this move entails costs for the Baltic economies as well. However, the strategic signaling from the Baltics is unambiguous. The price of security will be paid, regardless of the fiscal tag. The Baltic states have accepted the forfeiture of transit revenue from Russian cargo. The calculus has shifted. The cost of trading with Russia is no longer measured in currency, but in national survival. The removal of these tracks transmits a binary message to Moscow: we do not want your capital, "We do not want your rolling stock. We do not want you." This initiative is also a direct countermeasure to the Kremlin's hybrid warfare tactics, weaponized migration, airspace violations, and cyber offensives. The Baltics have abandoned a passive defensive posture. By dismantling the tracks, they are overturning the chessboard upon which hybrid warfare is waged. There is no game to be played if there is no board, no passage, no connection, only a sanitized buffer zone. What we are witnessing is not merely the removal of steel rails, it is a geopolitical checkmate. Historically, the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union projected power via the railway gauge. Where the rails extended, Russian military footprint, bureaucracy, and hegemony followed. The 520mm Russian gauge tracks in the Baltic states were the physical residue of this imperial project. As long as that infrastructure remained intact, the potential for Russian revanchism remained alive in strategic planning and on the map. Today, the decision ratified in Riga, Tallinn, and Vilnius permanently terminates Russia's physical access vector to Europe. This is the inversion of the Iron Curtain. During the Cold War, barriers were erected to keep the West out. Now, infrastructure is being dismantled to keep Russia in, to contain it within its own sphere of isolation. Let us analyze the military dimension of this strategy within a broader operational context. Modern warfare is, fundamentally, a war of logistics. As demonstrated in Ukraine, the Russian army's operational tempo degrades rapidly the moment it extends beyond railheads. Its mechanized units become sluggish, fuel logistics bog down in mud, and combat effectiveness collapses. By severing railway connectivity at the zero line, the Baltics are transforming any potential Russian offensive into a logistical nightmare before H hour. Russian armor might reach the border, but the sustainment trains required to feed them will hit a dead end. An army without a supply tail is merely a collection of stationary targets. But does this decoupling leave the Baltics vulnerable and disconnected? Is there a strategic replacement? Enter Rail Baltica. This is the game changer. An 870-kilometer, fully electrified, double-track corridor built to the European Standard 435mm gauge, capable of speeds up to 249 kilometers per hour, linking Tallinn to Warsaw. This project literally anchors the Baltic nations into the European logistical grid. While the legacy Russian lines run east-west toward Moscow, Rail Baltica runs north-south, straight into the heart of NATO. This is not merely a transportation project. It is a geostrategic realignment. It signifies the total obsolescence of Russia's military and economic leverage in the region. While Russia's antiquated rolling stock rusts at the closed border, NATO heavy armor and rapid reaction forces can deploy to Narva, Estonia's easternmost point in a matter of hours via Rail Baltica. This creates a technological asymmetry that upends the Kremlin's force projection calculations. Logistics experts and OSINT analysts confirm this move will strangle Russia's Kaliningrad connection and decapitate Belarus's export capacity. Specifically, Lithuania's option to hermetically seal its border with Belarus would constitute a death blow to the Minsk regime. The threat is no longer smuggled contraband, but impending systemic collapse. Do not underestimate the significance of gauge width. The Russian military is a rail-centric fighting force. Its logistics, ammunition supply, and troop mobilization are 90% dependent on rail throughput. These rails, unlike the standard European gauge, have remained at the 520mm width since the Tsarist era. A deliberate strategic choice designed to prevent European trains from invading Russia. But now, that weapon has backfired. When the Baltic nations excise these legacy tracks, Russian rolling stock will be physically stranded at the border, unable to proceed due to gauge incompatibility. Conversely, a NATO armoured brigade departing from Germany or Poland can deploy directly to the Russian frontier within hours, without the need for transloading or bogey exchanges. This is the essence of technological asymmetry. NATO's high-velocity, integrated logistics versus Russia's cumbersome, gauge-locked, and vulnerable supply chain. Furthermore, This move exacerbates the collapse of Russia's internal economic front. Russian Railways, RZD, is a state behemoth and a pillar of the economy. The closure of the western vector will blow a multi-billion-dollar hole in its revenue stream. Idle rolling stock, furloughed railway personnel, and widening budget deficits will increase domestic pressure on the Kremlin. Moscow is losing the hope that trade with Europe is merely paused. Without rails, trade is not paused, it is physically impossible. Lithuanian President Nausėda's appeal to the European Commission confirms that Rail Baltica is not just a regional asset, but a cornerstone of pan-European defence. Under the doctrine that Europe is preparing for high-intensity conflict, the defence line begins at the eastern border by removing the enemy's logistical pathways. This is the most lucid message sent to Russia. You are not part of Europe, and functionally, you never will be again. The Baltic nations have executed a bold maneuver that alters the trajectory of regional history. The grey zone has been eliminated. The era of dual-vector diplomacy, profiting from the east while protected by the west, is over. The removal of the rails marks the definitive end of Russia's century-long hegemony in the Baltic littoral. For the Kremlin, this induces strategic claustrophobia. The western gates are not merely locked, the roads leading to them are being erased from the map. With the removal of the rails, Belarus risks becoming a derelict property at the end of a cul-de-sac. Kaliningrad, meanwhile, is left adrift, isolated like a raft in a tempestuous sea. In summary, this dismantling of railway infrastructure may be the harbinger of a looming geopolitical storm. By severing the tracks, the Baltics have irreversibly decoupled the fate of Russia and Belarus from the West. For Moscow, every meter of rusted track removed represents a fragment torn from its imperial ambitions. The train has departed the station, and this time, Russia is left behind not on the platform, but beneath the tracks of history. Belarus is poised to share that fate. We invite you to share your strategic assessment in the comments section.